In the cold, final days of January 1547, the great palace of Whitehall was not a seat of power, but a hushed and fetid sickroom. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of burning herbs and the sharp tang of vinegar, could not mask the underlying stench. It was the smell of decay, a putrid odor of rotting flesh and mortal sickness that emanated from the very center of the kingdom, from the bloated, gargantuan body of King Henry VIII. Here, in a vast bed hung with tapestries depicting ancient victories and biblical splendors, lay a man who was no longer a king, but a monument to his own ruin. This was not the golden prince of the Renaissance, the poet, the musician, the athlete who had dazzled the courts of Europe. This was a 55-year-old man trapped inside a prison of his own making, a body swollen to grotesque proportions, a mind clouded by pain and paranoia, and a soul wrestling with the terrifying imminence of judgment. His story is often told as one of wives, wars, and the schism with Rome, a tale of absolute power wielded with brutal caprice. But the untold story, the one that truly defines the end of his monumental reign, is a far more intimate and terrifying narrative of physical and psychological disintegration. It is the story of how a man who saw himself as God's chosen instrument on earth was humbled by the most common of enemies, his own failing body. To understand the horrifying spectacle of Henry's end, we must delve into the grim reality of his decline, a process that was not merely a private agony, but a public and political crisis. How did the virile champion of the tilt-yard become a helpless invalid, so immense that he had to be winched and wheeled through the corridors of his own palaces? How did a mind once celebrated for its acuity curdle into a cauldron of suspicion and rage, where the slightest perceived offense could lead a loyal servant to the block? This narrative will peel back the layers of Tudor propaganda and sanitized history to reveal the raw, human tragedy at its core. It will explore the medical catastrophes that befell him, the political vultures that circled his dying form, and the desperate, terrifying obsession with legacy that consumed him even as his own life force ebbed away. This is not simply the story of a king's death. It is an autopsy of power itself, an examination of how the decay of a single man's body could threaten to unravel the very fabric of the nation he had forged in his own image. It is a cautionary tale about the illusion of control, the vanity of ambition, and the ultimate, undignified democracy of death. The central thesis of this exploration is that Henry's prolonged and agonizing death was the crucible in which the future of Tudor England was forged. His physical collapse was the direct catalyst for the vicious factionalism that defined his final years. The evangelical reformists, led by the ambitious Seymour brothers, and the religious conservatives, under the old guard of the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, were not merely jockeying for favor. They were fighting a war for the soul of the nation, and the king's sickbed was their battlefield. Every groan of pain, every moment of lucidity, every fevered rant from the monarch was a strategic opportunity or a terrifying setback. His death was not an end, but an ignition point, the firing of a starting gun in a race for control over his most precious and vulnerable legacy, his 9-year-old son and heir, King Edward VI. The story of Henry's last days is therefore the story of a profound and violent transfer of power, masked by the solemn pageantry of a royal demise, but driven by the raw, primal instincts of survival and ambition that the dying king himself had so masterfully employed throughout his own tumultuous reign. It is a bitter irony that Henry Tudor was never meant to be king. He was the second son, the spare, destined for a life in the church, perhaps to become a powerful Archbishop of Canterbury. His elder brother, Arthur, was the heir, the focus of all dynastic hopes. The young Henry, therefore, was allowed a different kind of education, one that cultivated the Renaissance ideal of the complete man. He was sharp-witted, a gifted linguist, a talented composer of music, and a passable theologian. But above all, he was an athlete. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with a powerful build and the distinctive red-gold hair of his Plantagenet ancestors, he was a force of nature. He excelled at the joust, in the tennis court, at the hunt. He was the personification of youthful vigor and martial prowess, a stark contrast to his frail, cautious father, Henry VII. When Prince Arthur died suddenly in 1502, the path to the throne unexpectedly cleared for this brilliant, charismatic second son. Upon his accession in 1509, at the age of just 17, he was seen as a breath of fresh air, a bluff King Hal who embodied a new era of English confidence and cultural splendor. The world Henry inherited was one of profound and rigid expectations for a monarch. In the 16th century, a king was more than a mere head of state. He was a semi-divine figure, God's anointed representative on earth. His body was not merely his own. It was the body politic, a living symbol of the health and integrity of the nation itself. A strong, virile king signified a strong, secure kingdom. A weak or sickly king, conversely, signaled divine displeasure and invited instability and foreign predation. Central to this concept of royal vigor was the absolute, non-negotiable duty to produce a legitimate male heir. After the brutal civil wars of the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor claim to the throne was still relatively new and insecure. A clear, undisputed line of succession was paramount. This obsession, this deep-seated national anxiety, would become the driving force of Henry's reign, justifying his break with the Roman Catholic Church, his succession of wives, and some of his most infamous acts of tyranny. The king's physical health and his reproductive capacity were not private matters. They were the central pillars upon which the entire security of the realm rested. For the first 2 decades of his reign, Henry more than lived up to the ideal. He was the picture of magnificence and power. Foreign ambassadors wrote in awe of his physical presence, his seemingly inexhaustible energy, his lavish court, and his intellectual confidence. He led armies into France, engaged in complex diplomacy, and famously authored a theological treatise defending the 7 sacraments against the teachings of Martin Luther, earning him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope, a title he would ironically cling to long after he had shattered the very institution that bestowed it. In these years, he was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and while the desperate quest for a male heir was a growing undercurrent of anxiety, his personal power and physical prime were beyond question. He was the sun around which the English court orbited, a man who seemed destined to live forever, a force of nature who believed utterly in his own divine mandate and his personal indispensability. This image of the Golden King, immortalized in the portraits of Hans Holbein, is the essential baseline against which the horror of his later transformation must be measured. It was a fall from a great height, a descent into a hell of his own body's creation. The precise moment the Golden Age ended can be dated with chilling accuracy. January 24th, 1536. On that day, at a tournament in Greenwich, the 44-year-old king, heavily armored, thundered down the tilt yard. His horse stumbled and fell, crushing its rider beneath it. Henry was knocked unconscious, and for 2 terrifying hours, it was believed he was dead. The court was thrown into a panic. His then-wife and Boleyn was so distressed by the news that she miscarried what she later claimed was a male child. While Henry eventually regained consciousness, the consequences of this fall would haunt him for the rest of his life. The accident severely aggravated a pre-existing injury to his leg, likely a varicose vein or an old osteomyelitis infection from a previous jousting mishap. From this point forward, the wound would not heal. It festered, developing into a chronic, suppurating ulcer that would become the focal point of his daily agony. This was the catalytic event, the turning point from which there was no return. The fall at Greenwich did more than just wound his leg. It shattered the myth of his invincibility and marked the beginning of his slow, inexorable physical decay. The immediate consequences were profound and multifaceted. The most obvious was the end of his athletic life. The king who had defined himself by his physical prowess could no longer joust, hunt with the same vigor, or even walk without significant pain. This forced inactivity led to a rapid and dramatic weight gain. The lean, powerful physique of his youth began to disappear, replaced by a growing mountain of flesh. Psychologically, the impact was just as devastating. Chronic, unrelenting pain is a corrosive force on the human spirit, and for a man of Henry's temperament, impatient, imperious, and accustomed to getting his own way, it was a form of torture. His famous temper, always formidable, now became volcanic and unpredictable. Courtiers learned to tread carefully, watching the king's leg for signs of a bad day. The wound itself became a source of constant humiliation. It required daily, painful cleanings and dressings by his physicians, and it emitted a foul stench that perfumes and herbs could not entirely conceal. This was the beginning of the transformation from bluff King Hal into the bloated, irritable tyrant of historical infamy. The open sore on his leg became a physical manifestation of the growing sickness in his mind and his rule. As the years progressed into the late 1530s and 1540s, Henry's physical deterioration accelerated into a truly horrifying spectacle. His weight ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, with a waist measurement that expanded to a staggering 54 inches. He became so immense that he was unable to support his own body. Walking became an ordeal, then an impossibility. He had to be moved about his palaces in a specially constructed chair, a primitive form of wheelchair, or hoisted between floors by a contraption of ropes and pulleys. The king who once vaulted into the saddle was now a helpless prisoner of his own bulk, dependent on his servants for his most basic movements. The ulcers on his legs, for he soon developed them on both, were the epicenter of his suffering. They would periodically close over, causing the pressure of the infection to build up inside his body, throwing him into raging, screaming fevers and agonizing pain. Then they would burst open, releasing a torrent of pus and foul-smelling liquid that would soak through his bandages and clothes. The court of Henry VIII, once the glittering center of the Renaissance, became a place shadowed by the constant, unavoidable reality of the king's putrefaction. This physical decay was the fertile ground in which the seeds of political conspiracy blossomed. As the king's body failed, the question of who would rule after him became the all-consuming obsession of the court. His only legitimate son, Edward, born to Jane Seymour in 1537, was a mere child. The government during his minority would be controlled by a regency council, and whichever faction dominated that council would hold the reins of the kingdom. Two powerful camps emerged, circling each other like wolves. The first was the reformist, or evangelical, faction, led by Edward's uncles, Edward and Thomas Seymour, and quietly supported by Henry's sixth and final wife, the pious and intelligent Catherine Parr. They sought to push England further towards Protestantism. Opposing them were the religious conservatives, led by the powerful and ancient aristocratic family of the Howards, specifically Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, and the shrewd, formidable Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner. They wished to halt the Reformation, perhaps even reverse it, and restore the old Catholic doctrines, if not the Pope's authority. The king's sick room became their chessboard. They fought for access to his person, for control of the dry stamp, a facsimile of his signature used when he was too weak to sign documents himself, and for influence over the final wording of his all-important will. Henry's physicians, meanwhile, were engaged in a desperate and losing battle. Armed with the limited and often brutal medical knowledge of the 16th century, they subjected the king to a litany of painful and ineffectual treatments. They lanced and drained his ulcers, a procedure that brought temporary relief but excruciating pain. They applied poultices made of various herbs, minerals, and animal parts. They cauterized the flesh with red-hot irons to try and seal the weeping sores. His diet, already rich and excessive, was a medical disaster, heavy in red meat and alcohol, which modern historians believe likely contributed to conditions such as type 2 diabetes and gout, further compounding his agony and immobility. Some modern retrospective diagnoses have suggested Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that can cause rapid weight gain and mood changes, or even the long-term effects of a traumatic brain injury from the 1536 fall. While the exact combination of his maladies remains a subject of debate, the outcome was clear. His medical team was powerless. Their frantic interventions served only to underscore the king's helplessness and deepen his sense of frustration and rage, which he would then vent upon the unfortunate courtiers and ministers around him. The king's personal suffering inevitably spilled out, poisoning the political landscape and his personal relationships. His mounting paranoia, fueled by pain and a growing awareness of his own vulnerability, made the court a place of terror. The execution of his trusted minister Thomas Cromwell in 1540, a political miscalculation he would later regret, was a sign of his increasing instability. The tragic farce of his marriage to the young Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, ended on the executioner's block after her adultery was revealed, a deep personal humiliation for the aging, impotent king. His final wife, Catherine Parr, a kind and reform-minded widow who acted more as a nurse than a spouse, even found herself in mortal danger. In 1546, the conservative faction, led by Bishop Gardiner, convinced the king that Catherine's evangelical leanings constituted heresy. They drew up a warrant for her arrest, which Henry, in a moment of pique and suspicion, actually signed. Only a desperate, last-minute appeal to the king's vanity and intellect, in which she skillfully submitted to his theological wisdom, saved her from the Tower and an almost certain death. This incident reveals the terrifying precarity of life at Henry's court, where even the queen was not safe from the lethal combination of her husband's failing health and the ruthless machinations of his counselors. Trapped within his decaying body, Henry's mind turned obsessively to the one thing he still felt he could control: his legacy. He was consumed by the succession. He tinkered endlessly with his will, trying to choreograph the future of England from beyond the grave. He fixated on the grand projects that would bear his name, pouring money into palaces like Whitehall and Nonsuch, and founding Trinity College, Cambridge. Yet this desire for immortal glory was shadowed by a deep and pervasive fear. He saw threats everywhere. His rages became legendary, with courtiers reporting that he was often unapproachable for days on end, roaring in pain and fury. In these moments of agony, his tyranny sharpened. He was a man staring into the abyss of his own mortality and lashing out at the world around him. He knew his great project, the Tudor dynasty, the independent Church of England, was fragile, resting on the life of one small boy. The psychological toll was immense. He was the absolute ruler of a powerful nation, yet he could not command his own flesh or halt the relentless march of time. This profound powerlessness fueled a desperate need to assert his authority in the most brutal ways imaginable, to prove, perhaps to himself most of all, that he was still the king. By the final months of 1546, the end was clearly approaching. The king's decline steepened into a final, irreversible collapse. He was largely confined to his chambers in Whitehall, often delirious with fever. His vast body was now almost completely inert, a landscape of pain and decay tended to by physicians and servants. Yet, even in this state of near-total physical helplessness, his grip on the instruments of power remained formidable and terrifying. It was during these last weeks that the final, decisive power play unfolded. The Seymour faction, sensing their moment, moved to eliminate their rivals once and for all. They compiled a case against the Duke of Norfolk and his son, the gifted but arrogant poet Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. The charges were flimsy, centering on Surrey's foolish and provocative use of the royal arms of Edward the Confessor in his personal heraldry, which was construed as a statement of his own family's claim to the throne. It was enough. The king, steeped in paranoia and easily convinced that his oldest and most powerful noble family was plotting to usurp his son, readily agreed to their destruction. The state of the king during this final crisis was a horrifying tableau of tenacity and decay. He was so weak he could barely hold a pen, his signature often being applied by the dry stamp, a device now firmly under the control of the reformist faction. The warrant for the execution of the Earl of Surrey was signed, and the young man was beheaded on January 19, 1547. The warrant for his father, the Duke of Norfolk, was prepared for January 28th. Henry, drifting in and out of consciousness, was a dying titan, capable of swatting his enemies with a final, lethal blow even as the life drained out of him. The courtiers who attended him walked on eggshells. They feared his rages, but they also feared being the one to tell him the ultimate truth. In the 16th century, it was considered treason to predict the king's death. For days, as he lay dying, no one dared broach the subject. Finally, Sir Anthony Denny, one of his most trusted gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, leaned close and bravely told the king that in man's judgment he was not like to live, and that he should remember his sins and turn to God. Henry, in a moment of lucidity, reportedly responded that he would, but that he wished to speak with Archbishop Thomas Cranmer first. By the time Cranmer arrived from his palace at Croydon, the king was speechless. The archbishop asked him to give a sign that he died in the faith of Christ. Henry, unable to speak, reached out and squeezed Cranmer's hand. It was his final act. The actions of the other key figures during this climax were swift, calculated, and ruthless. While the king's life hung by a thread, the Seymours and their allies were not praying for his soul. They were securing their future. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, along with Sir William Paget, the king's principal secretary, held the king's will. In the final days, they made crucial alterations, strengthening the power of the Regency Council they intended to dominate, and adding clauses that allowed them to distribute lands and titles to themselves. They controlled all access to the dying monarch, ensuring their conservative rivals, like Bishop Gardiner, were kept away. The arrest of the Howards was the masterstroke. By removing the Duke of Norfolk, the premier nobleman of the realm and the natural leader of the conservative faction, they decapitated the opposition. They were not just waiting for the old king to die. They were actively shaping the world that would emerge the moment he drew his last breath. It was a silent, bloodless coup, executed with chilling efficiency in the hushed, anxious corridors of a dying man's palace. In the early hours of Friday, January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII finally died. He was 55 years old and had reigned for nearly 38 years. His death, however, was not immediately announced. In a final act of political manipulation, Edward Seymour and his council kept the king's demise estate secret for 3 full days. This was a critical period. It gave them time to move Prince Edward securely to the Tower of London, traditionally the residence of a monarch before their coronation, and to consolidate their grip on the levers of government. The warrant for the Duke of Norfolk's execution, scheduled for the very morning of Henry's death, was left unfulfilled. It would have been unseemly to begin a new reign with the blood of such a high-ranking nobleman, and with his power broken, he was more useful alive in the Tower than as a martyr. On January 31st, the Lord Chancellor finally announced to a stunned Parliament that their great and terrible king was gone. In that moment, the 9-year-old Edward VI was proclaimed king, and Edward Seymour, his uncle, soon had himself declared Lord Protector, effectively making him the ruler of England in all but name. The silent coup was complete. The handling of Henry's colossal remains became a task of immense symbolic and practical difficulty. His body was embalmed, a gruesome process in which the organs were removed and the vast bodily cavity was stuffed with sawdust and preserving spices. He was then encased in a massive, custom-built coffin made of lead, so heavy that it required a team of strong men to move it. The plan was for a slow, grand funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, where Henry had decreed he should be buried in St. George's Chapel, alongside his most beloved wife, Jane Seymour, the mother of his heir. This final journey, however, was marred by a macabre and deeply symbolic incident. The procession rested overnight at Sion Abbey, a former monastic house that Henry himself had dissolved. During the night, the pressure of the gases building up within the decaying corpse caused the sealed lead coffin to burst open. The king's bodily fluids, mixed with the embalming liquids, leaked onto the floor. When attendants arrived in the morning, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. Dogs were present, licking the spilled remains from the chapel floor. This grotesque event was seen by many as a terrible and divine judgment. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy made years earlier by a friar, William Peto, who had condemned Henry's marriage to and bullied to his face, warning him that dogs will lick your blood, as they did Ahab's at the time. Henry had laughed it off and punished the friar. Now, in the cold light of his death, the words seemed to have come chillingly true. This incident, whispered fearfully throughout the kingdom, served as a potent symbol for the perceived corruption of his reign. The man who had torn down the abbeys was now having his own remains desecrated within the walls of one. The king, whose body politic was seen as diseased by the schism with Rome, now had his physical body literally burst apart from its own internal rottenness. It was a final, undignified postscript to a life obsessed with image and control, a demonstration that not even the most powerful king could escape the messy, humiliating reality of mortal decay. The propaganda of majesty had given way to the horror of putrefaction. The new regime, under the command of Lord Protector Seymour, immediately set about creating its own narrative. While they mourned the old king with all the required public pomp and ceremony, they quickly began to implement their own radical reformist agenda. They claimed they were merely fulfilling the true, unspoken wishes of the late king, pushing the Church of England in a far more Protestant direction than Henry himself had ever countenanced. The carefully amended will was presented as the king's final, sacred testament, providing the legal justification for Seymour's protectorate and the grants of land and titles he and his allies showered upon themselves. History was being rewritten in real time. The terrifying, capricious, and theologically conservative tyrant of his final years was being posthumously reinvented as the wise and forward-thinking founder of a new Protestant England. It was a masterful piece of political theater, a cover-up that used the very authority of the dead king to dismantle the religious settlement he had spent his last years trying to enforce. The Seymour faction had not just won the battle for the regency. They had seized control of Henry's legacy itself. The long-term consequences of the power vacuum Henry left behind were exactly what he had feared most: instability and religious strife. The reign of his frail son, Edward VI, saw England lurch violently into hardline Protestantism under the guidance of first Seymour and then the even more radical John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. When Edward died, just 6 years later, this was followed by a ferocious Catholic restoration under Henry's eldest daughter, Mary I, who earned the moniker Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. It was only with the accession of his younger daughter, Elizabeth I, in 1558, that a lasting and pragmatic religious settlement was achieved, finally bringing a measure of stability to the realm. The chaos of these intervening years was the direct inheritance of Henry's final decline. His obsession with securing the succession through a male heir had paradoxically led to one of the most insecure periods in Tudor history. The factionalism he had allowed to fester around his sickbed erupted into open conflict after his death, and the kingdom was torn apart by the very religious divisions he had unleashed but had tried and failed to control. To this day, Henry VIII remains a figure of intense historical debate. Was he a visionary monarch who liberated England from a foreign pontiff and laid the groundwork for its future as a great nation-state? Or was he a monstrous egoist, a tyrant whose greed, lust, and paranoia cost thousands of lives and fractured the spiritual unity of his kingdom? The medical diagnoses also continue to be debated. Was his decline simply the result of his jousting injury and morbid obesity, or were other, more complex pathologies at play? The theory of a Kell-positive blood group has been proposed to explain his wife's many miscarriages and stillbirths, while others point to the psychological impact of a lifetime of absolute power. What is not in dispute is the profound schism between the public image and the private reality. He commissioned portraits by Holbein that projected an image of unwavering, broad-shouldered power, even at a time when he could barely stand. This was the propaganda of a king terrified of showing weakness, a man who understood that in the theater of monarchy, perception was reality. The ultimate lesson of Henry's final years is a profound and moralizing one. It is a story about the absolute limits of human power when confronted by the biological certainties of aging and disease. Henry could execute dukes, cardinals, and queens. He could seize the vast wealth of the monasteries and declare himself supreme head of the church. But he could not heal the festering wound on his own leg. He could not halt the inexorable swelling of his own body or quiet the demons of pain and fear in his own mind. His story is a testament to the corrupting nature of absolute power, showing how a man's personal pathologies can become state policy and how his private agony can translate into public terror. He stands as a monumental cautionary tale, a symbol of human fragility and the vanity of earthly ambition. The king who fought so desperately to control his dynasty and secure his legacy ultimately left behind a kingdom on the brink of chaos, his grand plans hostage to the whims of feuding nobles and the frail health of his children. We are left, then, with two starkly contrasting images of the same man. First, there is the king of legend, the handsome, athletic prince, the magnificent autocrat, the larger-than-life figure who bestrides English history. This is the Henry of the palaces, the portraits, and the propaganda. But behind this facade lies the second image, the one revealed in the horrifying details of his final days, a man of grotesque size, rotting from the inside out, screaming in his bedchamber, his power maintained only by the terror he could still inspire and the frantic maneuvering of those who sought to inherit his crown. This contrast between the carefully constructed image of divine authority and the grim, malodorous reality of his physical decay is the essential truth of his end. He had made himself the center of his universe, the body politic incarnate. And so when his own body failed, it seemed as if the entire world he had built was threatening to collapse with it. In the end, the death of Henry VIII was more than the passing of a monarch. It was a brutal and visceral reckoning. It was the moment when the myth of the king's two bodies, the immortal, sacred body of the crown and the frail, mortal body of the man, collapsed into one horrifying reality. For all his wealth, his palaces, and his absolute authority, he died as all men do, but his death was magnified by the sheer scale of his life and power. The stench from his ulcers, the explosion of his coffin, the final desperate squeeze of Cranmer's hand. These are not mere lurid details. They are the essential, humbling truths of a reign built on an illusion of absolute control. Henry VIII, who had remade a nation in his own image, was ultimately unmade by his own humanity, providing a final, foul-smelling and unforgettable lesson that no crown, no title, and no claim to divine right can ever grant a man victory in his final war against his own mortal flesh.